Okay, I am now going to turn the microphone over to the chair of our Strategy and Policy Department, Dr. Mary Beth Erwick. Thank you.
Yes, every student's favorite department is strategy and policy. I know. We're the ones that give you all that reading. All right. Christian Saunders is Under-Secretary General and Special Coordinator on improving the United Nations response to sexual exploitation and abuse in international peace and aid operations. Mr. Saunders brings extensive experience to this role, having served in key management roles at the United Nations, including service as Acting Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. Mr. Saunders' commitment to gender equality as a core principle of the United Nations and his passion for addressing issues underlying sexual exploitation and abuse have earned him recognition as an international gender champion. That's a real thing. There aren't that many international gender champions. So now I want to turn the floor over to Mr. Saunders.
Admiral. Hello, everybody. Professor Hudson, you are a very difficult act to follow, but I'm going to try. And I always enjoy coming to these events before I start my intervention. I always enjoy coming to these events because I always learn something. And I'm very glad already that I did come to this event because, thank you, Professor Hudson, I did learn a lot this morning. So, it's an honor to stand before you today on the 11th Annual U.S. Naval War College Women, Peace and Security Symposium, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Naval War College for providing us with a platform to reflect on the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse, the progress that has been made, the challenges that persist, and where we go from here. It's poignant that this symposium is being held just after the close of the annual 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which ended last Tuesday on Human Rights Day, as inequality against women is the major driver for this scourge. At the outset, let me thank you all for being here, because today we affirm our shared commitment for gender equality, the full realization of women's rights, and the fundamental truth that sustainable peace and security cannot be achieved without the full and meaningful inclusion of women. At a time when the world is in disarray, in turmoil, it's burning up, and people are looking for ethical and moral leadership, for action, and for vision. The time to act is now. The theme of this symposium, Rethinking Global Security in a Complex World, is both vital and urgent. Next year, we will mark the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which made a landmark commitment to women's centrality to the work of peace and security. The resolution called upon member states and the UN to increase the representation of women at all decision-making levels and in all mechanisms for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. It also emphasized that parties to armed conflict must implement protective measures for women and girls against gender-based violence. Most importantly, it recognized that gender equality is a prerequisite for international peace and security, that conflict impacts women and girls in distinct ways, and that their involvement in peace processes is not only fair, but essential to achieving lasting peace. These words still ring true today. But sexual violence in conflict is growing more severe year by year, not less. According to UN data, reports of conflict related to sexual violence have increased by 50% over the past year alone, and women and girls account for 95% of those cases. At the same time, women are still largely excluded from peace processes following conflict. They make up just 9.6% of negotiators in formal peace processes, even though in 3/4 of conflict settings, women's groups are leading or playing a key role in the informal sector in terms of peace processes. This is the scale of the problem. This is the complex and unequal world we're discussing today. In most instances, lip service is paid to this issue, and women are not given a meaningful, if any, role in determining their future. The time is long gone when sexual violence was considered an inevitable byproduct of armed conflict. We now recognize it for what it is, not a byproduct of war, but a weapon of war, and not a workplace issue, but a profound violation of human rights, one which disproportionately targets women and girls, but also affects men and boys and minority groups. Most importantly, sexual violence is not something that just occurs on the outside of our institutions. Since 2010, the UN has received over 1,100 allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping missions, and approximately 60% of these involved uniformed personnel, members of national militaries from around the world, including the US. Last year alone, we received 100 reports linked to peacekeeping missions. This is particularly concerning when you consider that what is being reported is only the tip of the iceberg. Research shows that between 90 and 99% of cases go unreported. Behind each of these statistics is a fellow human being. Unless you have experienced it, it is very difficult to understand the damage that sexual exploitation and abuse causes to the individual and to the communities we serve. Survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse can be left with lifelong trauma and psychological harm, social stigma, and physical injuries. In some cases, they're stigmatized and ostracized from their own families and communities, no longer able to attend school or participate in public life. Most fathers abandon children born of SCA, condemning them to a life of poverty without medical care, schooling, a roof over their heads, and often not knowing where their next meal will come from. This is shameful. There are over 700 of such children in which the United Nations, member states, and the perpetrators are fundamentally implicated. These consequences last for generations, long after the war itself has ended. Each new case is a moral stain on our collective conscience. My role within the UN is to coordinate the UN system's response to sexual exploitation and abuse. When I refer to SEA, I'm talking about sexual violence, but not all sexual violence is SEA. Sexual exploitation refers to any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes. Sexual abuse refers to actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or under unequal or coercive conditions. Since my appointment 2 years ago, I have traveled to many countries where the UN operates, including to the peacekeeping missions and some of the high-risk troop-contributing countries, to engage firsthand with leaders, commanders, and uniformed personnel. Although we have made some progress in addressing SEA within the UN over the last 20 years, they have been what I would describe as limited and fragile. When SEA is committed by those entrusted to serve and to protect, it is more than a personal failing. It is an institutional derogation of duty, which erodes the very foundation of our mission, comprises the implementation of compromises the implementation of military and peacekeeping mandates, and it deeply damages the credibility of and the trust in our organizations, whether they be the United Nations or a country's military. Although SEA is prevalent in every society, we must remember that the risks are higher in countries where troops may be deployed. Conflict, displacement, housing and food insecurity, and weak or the absence entirely of rule of law leave people very vulnerable. They are vulnerable to abuse by the military. Your mandate, your weapons, your uniform, your international status, these things give you power over them. Power that can be and is unfortunately abused. At its best, the history of military service is one of distinguished collective accomplishment and personal sacrifice, in challenging conditions and against great odds. But every instance of sexual violence committed by uniformed personnel is a grave betrayal of everything we stand for, everything you signed up for the day you joined. It's a deep betrayal of those we signed up to protect and those who serve alongside us as our colleagues and our equals. Let us acknowledge that while much of our progress has focused on civilians, uniformed personnel face threats from within their own ranks. We often assume that the biggest threat to troops comes from hostile forces who wish to do them harm. But the reality is that many women, and some men, serving in uniform are at risk from their own colleagues. Recent studies estimate that at least 1 in every 3 women peacekeepers has personally experienced sexual exploitation and abuse at the hands of her colleagues. 1 in 3. These numbers are a product of the toxic, hypermasculine, patriarchal environments that continue within our organizations. But those of us who are here today are here because we know that SEA has no business in the military. It has no business in the UN, and it is our collective duty to do everything we can to prevent it. More than 24 years have passed since the adoption of Resolution 1325. Since then, 9 enforcing resolutions, 1820, 1888, 1889, 2242, and others, have expanded the WSP agenda through the dual pillars of participation and protection. The first advocates for women's active and effective participation in peacemaking and peacebuilding, and the second seeks to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. They build upon the legacy of women's rights movements, which have envisaged a world in which women are no longer mere participants, but equal architects of peace and security. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in 1995, the 30th anniversary of which we will mark next year, was a turning point in the global struggle for gender equality. Its strategic objectives for the advancement of women, the outcome of decades of activism and legal advancements, were adopted unanimously by 189 countries. We stand on the shoulders of these achievements today. But we know that resolutions alone cannot create change. At the last count, 109 UN member states have adopted national action plans to implement the principles of Resolution 1325 by enforcing them as domestic law and policy. These plans must not only be adopted, but actually implemented in practice. That means sustained leadership commitment, sustainable funding, rigorous implementation, and regular monitoring and reporting, including through robust accountability mechanisms. As we look to the next quarter century, the time has come to reaffirm our commitment to Resolution 1325. This demands real action rather than the lip service that it often gets. We must transform our organizations, policies, and practices to embed women's voices and perspectives at the heart of everything that we do in the areas of peace and security, and to do so consistently. Only by doing this can we achieve lasting change. To this end, there are several key areas where we can take immediate concrete action. Over the last 2 years, I have traveled extensively, and no matter the context, A major impediment, if not the biggest impediment, to our being successful in responding to SEA is the absence of committed leadership. Addressing sexual exploitation and abuse demands leaders who are courageous and decisive, and I don't know how many times you've heard that today, but it must be at least 5, who take action, who lead by example, and who champion a culture of respect, accountability, and safety that permeates every level of their command. Leaders here today, every member of your unit or team must know the why for the values-based culture that you espouse. They need to know how to intervene and what it means to be an upstander. They need to know where and how to report if they know something, and that if they come forward, that they will be met with respect and will be protected, not retaliated against. You cannot leave this just to the NCOs. You need to engage directly with your troops on an ongoing basis, especially those deployed to isolated areas. Conduct regular visits and meet with the soldiers to reinforce expectations of professional conduct. As a leader, you set the culture from the top, and it works its way down, and you bear ultimate responsibility. You have ultimate accountability for misconduct that happens on your watch. This also means confronting entrenched barriers that have, for centuries, minimized women's contributions and fueled impunity for misconduct. Across many member states and peacekeeping missions, women in the military are excluded from meaningful decision-making and leadership roles. Their contributions are sidelined, and the issues of exploitation and harassment are dismissed simply as women's issues. The 2 fundamental pillars of WPS that I talked about earlier, participation and protection. Remember, you cannot have one without the other. When we deny women full and equal participation in the work of peace and security, we legitimize the very same patriarchal and misogynistic culture that culminates in their exposure to sexual and gender-based violence. Leadership is a critical aspect of the cultural transformation that we must bring to our institutions. And to do this, we need to bring men along on the journey. And most importantly, and I'm looking at the gender balance in the room today, men need to bring other men along. SEA and gender equality are not women's issues, and nor are they soft issues. They are shared responsibilities that demand everyone's commitment. Men must step forward as allies, advocates, and essential partners in driving the necessary change. We need to embed these values in everything that we do. And to do this, we need to rethink our approach to training. Traditionally, conduct and sexual exploitation and abuse training has focused on compliance, a list of do's and don'ts. While these are important, we must foster an environment where personnel understand not only how to behave, but why these standards and values matter. This recognizes that education, not just training, is the cornerstone of prevention. True learning goes to the heart of an issue and delivers a clear understanding of the why. To this end, I applaud the work of the Naval College to broaden service members' understanding of associated issues like gender, human rights, and the protection of civilians. This should be modeled everywhere. Training alone cannot achieve lasting change. We must also integrate the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse into operational planning. This begins with risk assessments, which incorporate local knowledge and input from affected communities, including victims and survivors of SEA. Standard operating procedures should address SEA risk mitigation in all day-to-day operations, and most importantly, prevention must be embedded into operational protocols as a matter of course, not as an afterthought. In closing, as we look to the next quarter of a century of Resolution 1325, it is my profound hope that organizations, the military, member states, and others will finally give this issue the importance and attention that it warrants. If we want a better world, then it is a shared responsibility to work towards real, tangible change, rather than the current tokenism. We have the knowledge and the tools, and frankly, we owe it to the victims and survivors to the women and men who serve alongside us, and to the communities that we serve. I'm convinced that together we can build a safer, more equal, more just future. Our peace and our security depend upon it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those thorough, heartfelt, inside the organization remarks, and really how important relating it to, real people, events on the ground. To extend your comments, as you know, there's several hundred middle and senior ranking officers attending the Naval War College right now at the symposium. So, and you talked about, challenges within the actual conflict operations and the sexual exploitation and abuse that happens there. But you also talked about, a good deal of it takes place in our ranks, and to include the United States, as it does not have a great track record in this area. So, and you also talked about education versus training. Training's a little bit easier to do, and then we can just put that on the schedule. But what advice do you have for our students who will be going to all these units, will be assuming higher positions of responsibility throughout their services and countries' militaries to tackle this situation a little bit more effectively?
Thank you. It's a good question. I think it really depends on what level of command you're at. I think, let's assume to start with that, let's talk a little bit to start with about, let's assume you're somewhere in the middle. I think you have to learn and have to have the skills to be able to manage upwards. Often people think that it's the young soldiers that are committing sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse, but my experience is it can happen at any age or any rank, and in fact, I think it's often the sort of the people of my age and slightly younger who are the perpetrators. I think, to be frank, I think they joined the military at a different time when different things were acceptable or not acceptable. We're in a different world now, and people need to change, and they need to understand that this kind of behavior is simply not acceptable. So I think you have to learn to manage up. I know the military is based on command and control, and you obey an order, but I think you have to be able to have the skills to be able to influence up. In terms of your own men and women and your unit, I think that there's a lot you can do. I think the first thing is you have to, as the commander, you have to create a culture that is based on ethics and integrity and values, where this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable, and everybody knows it, and they know why. It's not just as I said, it's not just a question of do's and don'ts, it's a question of why. The damage it does, I think it's very difficult, unless you are a victim or survivor yourself, I think it's very difficult to imagine the pain and the trauma that being the survivor of sexual violence is like. It irrevocably changes your life. And I know that human beings are strong and people carry on with their lives, but make no mistake, the pain and the trauma from such events is huge. So that's the start. And then I think there are lots of practical things. I think, as I said, you have to involve women as equals in all aspects of military life and all aspects of command and operations. Over the last 2 years, I mean, when I first was appointed, I looked at what had been done in this area, and I found that a lot had been done in terms of frameworks, policies, procedures, SOPs, and training and the like. Where I found it missing was where the rubber hits the road. So, for example, let's say you have a small unit based in an isolated place, and let's use as an example the Central African Republic. Central African Republic is a huge country, very little infrastructure, heavy rains for 8 months of the year. So as a platoon commander or as a unit commander, you can be cut off with your unit for long periods of time. So there are practical things, such as making sure that your troops take leave regularly, making sure your troops are kept busy. It's a well-known fact that idle troops get into trouble. Make sure that they have a decent internet connection so they can keep that connection with their wives and their loved ones and their families on a regular basis. Make sure that they have sports facilities and sports equipment. Make sure they have recreation facilities so that when they come back from patrol or from finishing their work, they have something to do. Make sure the accommodation is decent and the food is decent. And I know the US, you're very good at this. Make sure you have a strong perimeter and that it's well guarded, and people who are guarding the entrances know what they're doing. Managed alcohol program. Alcohol is a well-known influencer of sexual violence. So I think there's a lot of practical things you can do. The Danes recently finished a study, and they found there were 3 things. One was keep the soldiers busy. Second thing was make sure that they took leave on a regular basis to reconnect with their families. And then focus on the NCOs, because the NCOs are closer to the men and women, and they have more understanding of what's going on in the unit often. I personally have a bit of a problem with the last one, because I think as the commanding officer, you hold the ultimate responsibility and accountability, and you need to know what's going on with your troops. And that includes after hours. Far too often people think that when it gets dark that your responsibility finishes until the next day. No, you have responsibility the whole time, and you need to ensure you know what your troops are doing. Simple things like bed checks, random bed checks and roll calls to make sure that everybody's there and they're not out in the local village or the local town. So I think there's a lot of practical things as well, but I think it starts with tone at the top, and you as the commanding officer, you set that tone and the culture within your unit.
So to extend this just a bit further, what are the strategic risks of not taking action against women's disproportionate experience of violence in war zones?
Well, firstly, I think it's just morally wrong. Mm-hmm. But I think there's only been one or two instances where a regular army has beaten or overcome insurgents. And I think the reasoning behind their being successful in overcoming the insurgency was that they won the hearts and minds of the local community. And I think don't underestimate winning the hearts and minds of the local community. And I think that's hugely important. And let's remember, you're there to protect the local community. And that's not just half of the local community, that's all of the local community. And that means that you're there to protect the women and girls that you're mandated to serve.
So you mentioned quite a bit in your remarks about this being coming up on the 30th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Obviously, great milestone, and those 109 national action plans and all that. But it still seems you seem to be a bit not quite satisfied with this framework. So what's missing? If you could, if you're king for the day, like to move this movement to the next level, maybe that's it too. Maybe it's a little bit stuck at this level. How do we get it to the next level?
Okay. I think there's a lot of lip service paid to this issue. I think leaders around the world, they know that they have to talk about women's equality and the like, but I think when it comes to actually doing things in practice, that's where it's not happening. And I think probably, maybe we need to have some specific deliverables by specific time periods in order to force it to go forward. But I think the biggest problem is, there's a lack of determined, committed leadership on these issues. I think there's a lot of talk, but there's not enough action.
So thanks, Christian, for keeping us focused on our foundational professional values, and for all of you for your great questions. And I think Dr. Johnson is going to give us some instructions.
Okay.
Let us say
Thank you.
thank you very much.